The county record listed it as parcel 9 Delta, 90 acres, one structure, condition unknown. No electricity, no running water, no road worth the name. And according to every person in Granger County, no future. But when Ethan Cole, a veteran with $300, a dying truck, and a dog named River, pushed open that rotting cabin door for the first time, something happened that no county record could ever explain. River, a dog who had survived 4 combat deployments without flinching, stopped walking. He stood in the center of that cold, dark, abandoned room, and he stared at the floor beneath an old wooden shelf. And he made a sound Ethan had not heard in 3 years, not since Fallujah, not since the last time something dangerous and hidden was buried beneath their feet. Ethan had learned in the bloodiest classrooms on Earth that when River stopped, the world stopped too. What was hidden beneath that cabin floor would not just change Ethan Cole's life. It would tear open a wound that the United States government had spent 20 years desperately trying to keep closed. And it would prove, beyond any shadow of doubt, that some men refuse to stay forgotten, even from the grave. The Granger County auction house smelled of burnt coffee, damp wool, and the particular staleness of a room where hope came to die quietly. It was a long, low-ceilinged space with folding chairs arranged in uneven rows and fluorescent lights that hummed with the persistence of an old argument. At the front, behind a podium that had seen better decades, stood the county auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Gerald Pitts, whose reading glasses sat permanently crooked on his nose, and whose voice carried all the enthusiasm of a man reading a phone book to an empty room. Ethan Cole sat in the very last row. He was 39 years old, though the lines around his eyes suggested a man who had lived considerably longer than that. He was not tall, but he was built with the kind of lean, functional strength that comes not from a gym, but from years of carrying weight across difficult ground. His hair was dark and cut close, his jaw was sharp and set, and his eyes, a quiet, watchful gray, moved continuously around the room with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent 2 decades being paid to notice things other people missed. He wore a simple dark green canvas jacket, worn but clean, faded jeans, work boots that had seen real work. On his left wrist, a battered field watch, the same one he had worn through 3 countries and 4 deployments. He had never replaced it. Some things you don't replace. At his feet, lying with a stillness that seemed almost meditative, was River. River was a Labrador mix, not the glossy golden retriever of magazine covers, but something leaner, darker, built lower to the ground. His coat was a deep chocolate brown that shifted to almost black along his spine and ears. His paws were large and scarred, the paws of a working dog, not a pampered one. He was 7 years old, retired from active military service 18 months ago, and he carried his retirement the way Ethan carried his, quietly, without complaint, but with a certain awareness in his deep brown eyes that suggested he had not entirely forgotten what he once was. River did not fidget. He did not chase the scents of strangers' shoes or react to the scrape of chairs or the low murmur of conversation around him. He simply lay with his chin resting lightly on his front paws and watched Ethan's face, the way a sailor watches the horizon, constantly, without drama, ready for whatever it showed him. Ethan had driven 14 hours from Tucson in a 1999 Chevy pickup whose heater worked on every 3rd attempt and whose back seat held everything he currently owned: 2 duffel bags, a sleeping bag, a rifle case, a small crate of basic tools, and a 30-pound bag of dog food. He had found the listing for parcel 9 Delta 3 weeks ago on the Granger County website, a tax foreclosure property. 17 years of unpaid taxes, 90 acres, 1 cabin. The listing was 4 lines long and included no photographs. He had called the county clerk's office for more information. The clerk, a young woman with a careful voice, had paused for a long moment before saying, very quietly, "Sir, I would encourage you to look at other listings." She had not said why. Ethan had written down the address and started packing. "Next item," Gerald Pitts announced, adjusting his crooked glasses. "Parcel 9 Delta, known locally as the Harlan property. 90 acres, single cabin structure, one well, condition unverified. Transferred to county through 17 consecutive years of unpaid property tax." The room changed. Not loudly, not with any single dramatic gesture, but Ethan felt it. The way you feel a room change when everyone in it receives the same piece of bad news at the same moment. A collective tightening, a shared held breath. Conversations that had been murmuring quietly simply stopped. Ethan looked around the room slowly. Farmers in weathered overalls, ranchers in clean-pressed shirts, a couple of sharp-eyed speculators near the front in matching North Face jackets, local business people, a woman from the county assessor's office with a clipboard. Every single one of them was now looking at the floor, or at their phones, or at some fascinating point in the middle distance. Not at each other, not at the auctioneer, and not, with very deliberate, very careful intention, at Ethan. "We'll open bidding at $300, Pitt said, his voice dropping half a register, as though even he found the number slightly embarrassing. Ethan raised his hand. The silence that followed was not the competitive silence of a room considering its options. It was the silence of a verdict already reached. River lifted his head slightly, his ears rotating forward, reading the room the way he had been trained to read a street, a corridor, a tree line. He looked up at Ethan. Ethan kept his hands steady. "I have 300 from the gentleman in the back," Pitt said. "Do I hear 350? Nothing. Not a hand. Not a murmur. Not even the creak of a chair. "Going once," Pitt said, and his voice had taken on the flat, resigned quality of a man watching something inevitable unfold. "Going twice." The gavel came down. The sound of it, sharp, wooden, final, echoed in the low-ceilinged room like a door slamming shut. "Sold, $300, to the gentleman in the back." As Ethan stood and made his way to the front to sign the paperwork, the room broke into a low murmur behind him. Not the competitive chatter of a crowd reacting to a surprising sale. Something quieter than that. Something that felt, if he was honest, more like a eulogy. He caught fragments as he walked. Doesn't know what he's walking into. Harlan property, Lord have mercy. Tried to warn him. Someone should. The county clerk who processed his payment was a different woman from the one he had spoken to on the phone. Older, with silver hair and careful hands. She processed the deed with a brisk efficiency that felt, underneath it, like someone doing an unpleasant task as quickly as possible. When she slid the deed across the counter to him, she met his eyes for exactly 1 second. In that second, she said nothing, but her expression said, "I'm sorry." Ethan folded the deed into his jacket pocket. He looked down at River, who had padded silently to his side. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's go find out what we just bought." The town nearest to the Harlan property was called Hadley Creek. Population, according to a sun-bleached sign at its outskirts, was 1,200. Though looking at the main street as Ethan drove slowly through it, that number seemed optimistic. Half the storefronts were dark. The gas station was open but unstaffed, running on card payment only. A barbershop with a faded pole. A diner. And at the far end of the main street, a hardware and general store with a hand-painted wooden sign above the door. Cross Hardware and Dry Goods, since 1961. Ethan pulled over. He needed rope, lamp oil, matches, canned food, and a new padlock. Basic supplies for a place with no power and no certainty. Inside, the store smelled of sawdust, machine oil, and the faint sweetness of dried fruit from a bin near the back. Shelves ran floor to ceiling along both walls, packed with the practical inventory of a community that solved its own problems. A wood stove in the corner ticked softly with heat. Behind the counter stood a man who appeared to be somewhere between 70 and the end of time. He was slight, almost bird-like in his build, with a full head of white hair worn slightly long and hands that were spotted with age but moved with the confidence of someone who had fixed everything in this county at least once. His name, stitched on the front of his canvas apron in faded red thread, was Walt. Walt watched Ethan gather his items with the frank, open curiosity of a man who had earned the right to stare at strangers. "You the one who bought the Harlan place?" he said as Ethan set his items on the counter. "News travels fast," Ethan replied. "Son, in a town this size, news doesn't travel," Walt said pleasantly, beginning to tally the items. "It's just already everywhere." He punched numbers into a register that appeared to be from the early 90s. "I'm going to tell you something," Walt said without looking up, "and I want you to understand I'm telling you as someone who has lived in this county for 63 years and has no reason to lie to you." "Go ahead," Ethan said. Walt set down his pencil, looked at Ethan directly with eyes that were pale blue and entirely without evasion. "The man who owned that property before the county took it, his name was Douglas Harlan. He was a veteran. Korean War-era family, served himself in Vietnam. Good man, quiet, kept to himself up in those hills for years without bothering a soul." He paused. Then, about 20 years ago, he started asking questions about Fort Briggs. Ethan had seen the reference on the county map, a decommissioned military installation in the hills north of the property, closed 1996. "What kind of questions?" Ethan asked. Walt picked up his pencil again, set it down again, as if he needed something to do with his hands for what came next. "About the men who were stationed there in the late 80s and early 90s. Specifically, the men who went in and didn't come out, and the men who did come out but weren't right afterward. Sick, changed, some of them dead within a few years of discharge." The store was very quiet. Outside, through the window, Ethan could see River sitting patiently in the passenger seat of the truck, watching the door. "Douglas had a nephew who was stationed at Fort Briggs," Walt continued. "Boy named Thomas, 22 years old, died of a blood disorder 14 months after discharge. Government said it was unrelated to service. Benefits denied." Walt looked at Ethan steadily. "Douglas spent 3 years trying to find out what happened to Thomas, trying to find other families, trying to build a record." "And?" Ethan said, though something in his chest had already begun to understand where this was going. "And one morning his truck was found on the road 7 miles from his property, engine running, door open, his dog sitting beside it." Walt's voice did not waver, but something behind his eyes did. "That was 16 years ago. They never found Douglas. The official report said he likely wandered into the wilderness and succumbed to exposure." A pause. "Douglas Harlan was a man who had survived 2 tours in Vietnam," Walt said quietly. "He did not succumb to exposure." Ethan paid for his items. He counted out his remaining money, $42. He picked up his bag. At the door, he stopped. "The Fort Briggs installation," he said. "Is it still restricted access?" Walt looked at him for a moment. "Officially decommissioned," he said. "Fencing still up, signs still posted. Nobody goes up there." "Nobody?" "Nobody who comes back and talks about it," Walt said simply. Ethan nodded. He walked out into the gray afternoon, loaded his supplies into the truck bed, and climbed into the cab. River pressed his nose briefly against Ethan's jaw, a single warm touch, then turned to look out the windshield. "I know," Ethan said. "Me too." He started the engine and drove north toward the hills. The road became a track. The track became 2 ruts. The ruts became a suggestion. Ethan drove the last 2 miles in first gear, the truck groaning through overgrown brush that closed in on both sides like a corridor being slowly swallowed. Branches scraped the roof. The ruts deepened. Twice he had to stop and move fallen branches before he could continue. He noticed other things as he drove. A section of fence that had been cut and then propped back into position, not repaired, just replaced, as if someone had wanted to maintain the appearance of a barrier while preserving the ability to pass through it quickly. A pile of stones on the left side of the track, arranged in a pattern that was almost natural, almost, but not quite, too deliberate, too evenly spaced. An old rusted chain hung loosely between two posts, not locked, not fastened, just draped. Symbolic, not functional, like a sign that said stay out without actually preventing anything. These were not the marks of a property abandoned to nature. These were the marks of a property that someone had spent time, careful, methodical time, making look abandoned. There was a difference. Ethan had spent enough years in places where the difference mattered to recognize it. Then the track opened. The clearing was small, 50 yards across, ringed on all sides by pines so tall they blocked the sky at their tops and turned the clearing into a kind of natural room. The light inside it was gray and even, the kind of flat, diffuse light that comes on overcast afternoons and makes distances hard to judge. The cabin stood at the far edge of the clearing. It was smaller than he had imagined, built of dark logs, old-growth timber, the kind they didn't cut anymore, chinked with mortar that had crumbled in places to dust. The porch ran the full width of the front, sagging noticeably on the right side where a support post had rotted through. The roof was intact, which was more than he had expected. The stone chimney rose from the left side of the roofline, thick and solid, coated in a fur of gray-green moss. The two front windows were dark, not broken, but so layered in grime and algae that they admitted almost no light. The front door was closed, not locked, just closed. Ethan killed the engine. The silence that descended was not simply the absence of sound, but a physical presence, something large and very old that had been sitting undisturbed in this clearing for a very long time and was now, with the greatest of patience, turning to look at him. He and River stepped out of the truck together. The air was extraordinary, cold and clean and layered, pine and damp soil, and beneath both of those, something earthier, older, the particular scent of a place that had been sealed away from the world. "Well, River," Ethan said softly. His voice sounded strange out here, too small, too human. "Here we are." River pressed lightly against his leg. His nose was working, rapid, precise, methodical, reading the air the way a musician reads a score. The porch groaned under Ethan's weight but held. He pushed the front door open with his shoulder. It resisted at first, swollen in its frame from years of moisture cycling, then gave with a low groan and swung inward. The smell hit him first. Cold ash, mouse, decay. And beneath those, something drier, older. The smell of a space that had been sealed, not abandoned. There is a difference. Abandoned spaces smell of open rot, of wind and rain finding their way in over years. Sealed spaces smell of stasis, of time compressed, of air that has been sitting still for so long it has lost the ability to move. This smelled of stasis. Ethan stepped inside. The main room was large by cabin standards, perhaps 20 feet by 20. A stone fireplace dominated the left wall, floor to ceiling, constructed from river rock fitted together with the patient craftsmanship of someone who had built it to last. A wooden table sat in the center of the room, two chairs tucked beneath it, a film of dust over everything thick enough to write in. Against the back wall, a cast-iron bed frame stood bare to its springs. A wooden shelf ran the length of the right wall, holding a row of objects: a tin cup, a small glass bottle, a folded cloth, a paperback book lying face down with its spine creased, a kerosene lantern. These were not the scattered remnants of a place stripped by time and weather. These were the possessions of a man who had set them down, intending to pick them up again. Ethan stood in the center of the room and felt the weight of that, the terrible, suspended quality of a life interrupted. And then River stopped walking. He had been moving quietly around the perimeter of the room, nose to the floor, reading the baseboards, the corners, the cold hearth. Standard procedure. Ethan had watched him do it 1,000 times. But now he was still. He stood at the base of the wooden shelf along the right wall, and he was not moving. And the sound coming from deep in his chest was not a bark, not a whine, not any of the dozen sounds Ethan knew how to read quickly and respond to. It was lower than all of those. It was the sound River made when something was buried beneath him that should not be there. Ethan had heard it 4 times in his life. Every single time, it had been right. "Show me," Ethan said quietly. "River, show me." River pressed his nose to the floor at the base of the shelf, specifically to a single flat rectangular stone set flush with the rest of the floor, but rimmed by a seam that was, upon close inspection, marginally too clean, too precise, too deliberately uniform to be original construction. Ethan knelt beside his dog. He ran his fingers along the seam the way a surgeon runs a finger along a suture line, reading it. The mortar in the gap was different from the mortar elsewhere in the floor. Elsewhere, it was pale and sandy and crumbling at the touch. Here it was darker, denser, applied in a smooth, continuous bead, like a seal. Ethan pulled out his utility knife and pressed the blade into the seam. It sank in a 1/4 inch, resistant but yielding, the consistency of very old putty rather than stone. He worked the blade carefully around the full perimeter. River sat back and watched, his head tilted at the precise angle it always tilted when he was thinking. Ethan retrieved his short crowbar from the bag he had brought in from the truck. He wedged the flat end into the seam at the far edge of the stone, where his knife work had created the most give, and leaned his weight into it. Nothing. He repositioned, applied pressure more gradually this time, not a sudden force, but a steady, sustained one, the way you open a rusted valve. The kind of patience that comes from learning the hard way that sudden force breaks things you need intact. A sound, low, reluctant, the sound of a seal broken that was never intended to be broken, and the edge of the stone lifted a fraction of an inch. Ethan worked the bar around to a second point, then a third. Each time the same patient, steady pressure. Each time the stone rose a little more. Finally, with both hands gripping the edge, his fingers finding purchase in the gap the crowbar had opened, he lifted. The stone was enormously heavy. He got it 6 inches up, repositioned his grip, got it to a foot, then dragged it sideways and let it down onto the floor beside him with a thud that shook the cabin and sent a small cloud of ancient dust into the still air. River was immediately at the edge of the hole, nose down, reading what was below. Ethan held his flashlight over the opening. Below was a cavity, roughly 2 feet deep, 3 feet long, 1.5 feet wide, lined on all sides with flat stones carefully fitted together. The floor of the cavity was dry, not damp with the moisture of soil, but bone dry, the air inside it preserved by the seal above. Resting on the floor of the cavity were 3 objects. The first was a military document pouch, olive drab, heavy-duty nylon, sealed with a double zipper and a small combination lock, the kind issued for transporting sensitive materials in the field. The second was a small wooden chest, handmade, constructed from what looked like sections of the cabin's own scrap lumber, fitted together with hand-cut dovetail joints. On its lid, burned into the wood with meticulous care, was an image, a row of small crosses. The third was a glass jar, sealed with a rubber gasketed lid. Inside the jar, rolled tightly and tied with a strip of cloth, was a piece of paper. Ethan looked at River. River looked back at him, his deep brown eyes steady and warm and carrying something in them that Ethan had learned over 7 years to read as clearly as language. "This is what we came for." Ethan reached down and carefully lifted all 3 objects out of the cavity. He carried them to the table. He sat down. He opened the jar first. The paper inside the jar was a letter. It had been written in pencil on 3 sheets of lined paper, the handwriting small and compressed and absolutely legible, the handwriting of a man who had spent his life putting important things on paper and understanding that clarity was a form of respect for the reader. Ethan smoothed the sheets flat on the dusty table and read, "To whoever finds this, my name is Douglas Harlan. I am 71 years old. I am a veteran of the United States Army, and I have lived on this land for 34 years. I am hiding this because I believe I am running out of time to do things in the open. If you are reading this, that belief was probably correct. I need you to understand what is in the pouch and the chest before you decide what to do with them, so I am going to tell you a story. It is not a long story, but it is a true one, and it belongs to men who deserve to have their truth told. In 1987, the United States Army established a research program at Fort Briggs, located approximately 7 miles north of this property. The program was classified. It was not listed in any public record. Soldiers assigned to it were transferred under administrative codes that removed them from standard unit records, a process that, to the outside observer, made it appear they had been assigned to various unremarkable postings across the country. In reality, they were at Fort Briggs. I do not know the full scientific details of what was done there. What I know, what I have been able to document, is this. Between 1987 and 1994, approximately 40 soldiers were stationed at Fort Briggs for periods ranging from 8 months to 3 years. During that time, they were subjected to prolonged, controlled exposure to experimental compounds, the specific nature of which I have not been able to fully determine, though the symptoms that followed suggest radiological and chemical elements. The men were not told what they were being exposed to. They were told they were participating in standard field readiness assessments. Of the approximately 40 men I have been able to identify, 31 died within 10 years of their discharge. The causes of death listed on their records vary: blood disorders, organ failure, aggressive cancers. In every case I examined, the family was told the illness was unrelated to military service. In every case, benefits were denied. In several cases, families who pushed back were visited by individuals presenting government credentials and advised, in language that was polite but entirely clear, to discontinue their inquiries. My nephew, Thomas Harlan, was one of those 31 men. He was 23 years old when he died. He never knew what had been done to him. I have spent the last 4 years building the record that is in this pouch. It contains copies of original documents, duty assignment records, medical files, correspondence between Fort Briggs personnel and a classified DoD research division. I obtained these through sources I will not identify here, because those sources are still living and I will not put them at risk. The chest contains something else. Open it carefully. The men who are buried at Fort Briggs, on the North Ridge, inside the old perimeter fence, in a section that does not appear on any official map of the installation, deserve to come home. Their families were told they had deserted, or died in unrelated accidents, or simply disappeared. I have marked the location on a map that is inside the pouch. I am one old man and I have run out of road. But the truth does not run out of road. It just needs someone new to carry it. If you are the kind of person who found this place and opened this stone, then you are probably the kind of person who understands what it means to carry something for someone who can no longer carry it themselves. Please, Douglas Harlan. Ethan set the letter down. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the far wall for a long time. Outside, the wind had come up. A low sound moving through the pines, rising and falling like breathing. River padded to his side and sat, pressing his warm, solid weight against Ethan's leg. Ethan looked down at him. The dog looked back, patient, steady, present. 31 men, Ethan said quietly. His voice was level, but his jaw was tight, and his hands, still flat on the table, had closed slowly into fists. He reached out and opened the wooden chest. Inside, nestled in a bed of folded cloth, were small paper cards, the kind used for filing or indexing. Each one bore a name, a service number, a date of assignment to Fort Briggs, and a date of death. 31 cards. Each one filled in the same careful pencil hand. Beneath the cards was a photograph. A group of young men in uniform, standing in rows on a dirt parade ground, grinning at the camera with the uncomplicated confidence of people who believe they are safe. Someone, Douglas presumably, had written along the bottom edge in the same precise hand, Fort Briggs, spring 1989. They trusted us. Ethan looked at those faces for a very long time. Then he opened the military document pouch. He was 3 hours into reading Douglas's documentation, cross-referencing the copied records against the handwritten notes, building the full shape of what had been done, when River's head came up. Not gradually, not with the slow awakening of a dog reacting to a distant sound. Instantly, completely. Every part of him shifting from rest to readiness in a single heartbeat, the way a switch moves from off to on, no middle position. Ethan had the lamp out and his rifle in his hands before the thought had fully formed. The cabin dropped into darkness, broken only by the faint orange breath of the fire's last embers. Through the grime-layered window, headlights, moving slowly up the track from the direction of the road. No hurry, no attempt at concealment. The lights of someone who did not feel the need to arrive quietly because they did not believe they would encounter resistance. The vehicle stopped directly outside. One door, one set of footsteps, heavy, unhurried on the porch boards. 3 knocks, the kind that are not really asking. Ethan moved to the door. River flanked him, low and silent, his body a coiled question waiting for an answer. Ethan opened the door 4 inches and held it there. The man on the porch was large, broad through the shoulders and thick at the neck. Mid-50s, with a face that had been handsome once and had since been weathered into something harder. He wore a Granger County Sheriff's Department jacket and a wide-brimmed hat dusted with light rain. His eyes, in the dim light from outside, were the color of old pewter. "Evening," he said. His voice was a low, even baritone, the voice of a man accustomed to rooms going quiet when he spoke. "Sheriff Dale Morrow, just doing a property check. Heard the old Harlan place finally went at auction today." "At night," Ethan said. "Long hours," Morrow said pleasantly. His eyes were not on Ethan's face. They were moving, slowly, deliberately, across everything visible through the 4-inch gap. The table, the shelf, the fireplace. "Mind if I step in? It's cold." "I'm comfortable here," Ethan said. A brief pause. Something shifted in Morrow's expression, too fast to name, but not too fast to notice. "Sure," he said. "Sure. Find everything all right? Old place like this, man could find all kinds of things left behind by the previous owner. Paperwork, old junk, you know how it is." The word paperwork arrived with a weight that had nothing to do with paper. "Nothing but dust and mice," Ethan said. Morrow nodded slowly, as though considering this. "Well, you should know this land has a complicated history. Previous owner was troubled. Left a lot of unresolved issues behind him. Wouldn't want a new owner getting tangled up in things that don't concern him." "I appreciate the advice," Ethan said. "Free of charge," Morrow said. He touched the brim of his hat. "You need anything, you call the department." He turned and walked back to his vehicle, unhurried, deliberate, the walk of a man making a point of not hurrying. Ethan watched the taillights disappear down the track. Then he pulled on his coat, took his flashlight, and walked around both sides of the cabin and his truck in the dark. He found it on the truck's rear driver's side tire, a clean, precise cut in the sidewall, not a puncture from road debris, but a deliberate slice, made with a sharp, thin blade, positioned to cause a slow, irreversible leak. Ethan crouched in the darkness beside his slowly deflating tire and looked at the cut for a long moment. River sat beside him, looking at it too. "Message received," Ethan said quietly. He stood up, went back inside, sealed Douglas's documents back into the hidden cavity, replaced the stone, covered the seam with ash. Then he sat in the dark with his rifle across his knees and his dog pressed warm against his side. He did not sleep, but he did think. And by the time the first gray light began to feel its way through the grimy windows, he knew exactly what his next move was going to be. A brief pause. Something shifted in Morrow's expression, too fast to name, but not too fast to notice. "Sure," he said. "Sure. Find everything all right? Old place like this, man could find all kinds of things left behind by the previous owner. Paperwork, old junk, you know how it is." The word paperwork arrived with a weight that had nothing to do with paper. "Nothing but dust and mice," Ethan said. Morrow nodded slowly, as though considering this. "Well, you should know this land has a complicated history. Previous owner was troubled. Left a lot of unresolved issues behind him. Wouldn't want a new owner getting tangled up in things that don't concern him." "I appreciate the advice," Ethan said. "Free of charge," Morrow said. He touched the brim of his hat. "You need anything, you call the department." He turned and walked back to his vehicle, unhurried, deliberate, the walk of a man making a point of not hurrying. Ethan watched the taillights disappear down the track. Then he pulled on his coat, took his flashlight, and walked around both sides of the cabin and his truck in the dark. He found it on the truck's rear driver's side tire, a clean, precise cut in the sidewall, not a puncture from road debris, but a deliberate slice, made with a sharp, thin blade, positioned to cause a slow, irreversible leak. Ethan crouched in the darkness beside his slowly deflating tire and looked at the cut for a long moment. River sat beside him, looking at it too. "Message received," Ethan said quietly. He stood up, went back inside, sealed Douglas's documents back into the hidden cavity, replaced the stone, covered the seam with ash. Then he sat in the dark with his rifle across his knees and his dog pressed warm against his side. He did not sleep, but he did think. And by the time the first gray light began to feel its way through the grimy windows, he knew exactly what his next move was going to be. He left at first light with River, a pack, the map from Douglas's pouch, his compass, his rifle, and 2 days of supplies. The trail north did not exist in any navigable sense. It was a memory of a trail, a direction more than a path, suggested by subtle breaks in the undergrowth and the occasional cairn of stones placed by someone who had walked this way with enough regularity to mark it. Douglas Harlan, Ethan understood, had walked this way many times. The terrain climbed steadily, through dense pine forest that blocked the sky, across exposed rocky outcroppings where the wind came from the north with a blade-like sharpness, through shallow creek crossings where the water ran black and cold over smooth stones. River moved ahead and alongside, covering twice the ground Ethan covered, his nose working the air continuously. He was in his element out here, focused, purposeful, entirely alive in a way that was different from his life in Tucson, in apartments and parking lots and the flat sameness of city streets. After 2 hours, the terrain changed. The trees thinned, the ground leveled, and ahead, through the last line of pines, Ethan could see it, a long, flat ridge, perhaps 200 yards across, framed by rock faces on the north and west and by forest on the south and east. He walked to the edge of the tree line and stopped. The ridge had been cleared long ago by human hands. The stumps were old, gray and soft with decades of weathering, but they were stumps, not natural ground. Someone had taken the trees off this ridge deliberately. At the far edge, almost swallowed by the slow return of brush and low grass, 2 rows of flat stones. Ethan walked toward them slowly. River did not run ahead. He walked beside Ethan, matching his pace exactly. The stones were roughly the same size, each one perhaps 18 inches long and a foot wide, set level with the ground, each placed with the same spacing from the next. Some had sunk partially into the earth over the decades. Some were covered with moss. Some were clean on top, as if someone had brushed them off not long ago. On each stone, scratched into the surface with something sharp, a knife perhaps, or a nail, were 2 or 3 initials and a year. WP 1991, RM 1990, JT, 1992. Ethan moved slowly along the rows, reading each one. He counted under his breath. When he reached the end of the second row, he stopped. 31 stones. He stood at the end of the row and looked back along its length, the two lines of small flat markers disappearing into the grass and the morning light, each one the only monument to a man whose family had been told he had simply ceased to exist. Ethan removed his cap. He stood at attention, spine straight, chin level, heels together, the posture that had been drilled into him and that, at this moment, was the only language he had that was adequate. River sat at his left side, perfectly still. The wind moved through the grass around the stones with a sound that was almost like voices. Ethan stood there for a long time. "I found you," he said finally. His voice was very quiet. "It took too long, but I found you. You're not forgotten anymore." He was back at the cabin by afternoon. He moved with the focused efficiency of a man working against a clock he could not see but could feel. He photographed every document in Douglas's pouch, every page of the handwritten notes, the map, every index card from the wooden chest, the photograph of the young men at Fort Briggs. He photographed each stone on the North Ridge. Then he drove to Hadley Creek, parked 2 blocks from the main street, and went to the public library, a single room attached to the back of the town hall, staffed by a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Paulson, who asked no questions and pointed him to the computer in the corner. Ethan used an encrypted email account he had maintained for 4 years and never used. He composed a single, careful email, attached every photograph, wrote 2 paragraphs, clear, factual, without embellishment, describing what he had found and where. The recipient was a woman named Dana Reyes, an investigative journalist based in Chicago who had spent 8 years covering military accountability cases. Her work was known. Her sources were protected. She answered to no local or state authority. He sent the email. Then he found the payphone outside the gas station, one of perhaps 3 remaining payphones in the state, and called Dana Reyes's direct line. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Reyes, my name is Ethan Cole," he said. "I just sent you something to your secure address. I need you to open it tonight." A pause. "Who are you?" "A veteran who found what another veteran spent his life trying to show the world." A longer pause. He could hear her breathing change slightly, the particular quality of a journalist who has just registered that a call is real. "I'm opening it now," she said. "Don't go anywhere." Ethan looked down at River, sitting calmly beside the payphone. "We're not going anywhere," he said. They came at 2 a.m. River woke Ethan with one sharp bark, immediately followed by complete silence, pressing himself flat against the wall beside the window with the practiced precision of a dog who understood that noise after the warning was a liability. Ethan was on his feet and rifle in hand in 4 seconds. Through the window, 4 vehicles, spread across the clearing in a deliberate pattern that covered all exit angles. Men dismounting quickly, efficiently, in dark clothing. No uniforms, no markings. Moving with professional coordination. Not law enforcement, private. Ethan counted 8 men, maybe 10. He looked at River. River looked back, his dark brown eyes absolutely steady. Not afraid, not hesitant. Ready. "Okay," Ethan said quietly. "Together." What followed was the longest 40 minutes of Ethan's life since Fallujah. He fought the way his training had taught him to fight when alone against numbers, not confrontationally, but environmentally, using the cabin itself as a weapon. Darkness, angles, misdirection, the deep, disorienting quality of an unfamiliar space at night against men who had never been inside it. He fired 5 times, controlled, targeted, communicating rather than killing, each shot saying, "I know where you are and I am not afraid of you." River moved through the cabin like water, silent, swift, finding the gaps. The man who came through the side window expecting an empty room found instead 90 pounds of focused, trained, entirely unhesitating dog. River did not tear or thrash. He controlled, clamping with precision onto the intruder's weapon arm and holding, his entire body weight anchoring the man to the floor until Ethan could secure him. Two men ended up zip-tied to the porch posts. The others pulled back. Stalemate. And then, just as the sky to the east was beginning its first pale concession toward morning, a sound arrived from above. The rhythmic, powerful thud of rotor blades. More than one aircraft. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, River at his side. Two helicopters came in low from the south, their navigation lights cutting through the pre-dawn gray. The first bore FBI markings along its fuselage. The second was dark, no markings, no lights beyond the navigation minimum, the particular anonymous authority of a federal aircraft that does not need to announce itself. They landed in the clearing, the downdraft flattening the grass and scattering the thin snow that had fallen overnight. A woman was the first person out of the lead helicopter. She was 40, perhaps, with close-cropped hair and the kind of face that processed information quickly and completely. She wore an FBI jacket over civilian clothes. She had come fast, Ethan understood. She had not waited for morning. She walked directly to Ethan. "Dana Reyes sent me her files at 11 p.m., she said. "My name is Special Agent Carol Briggs." She paused. No relation to the fort. "The original evidence is under the hearthstone," Ethan said. "It's intact." Agent Briggs looked at him, then at River, who regarded her with calm brown eyes. "Your dog found it?" "He always finds it," Ethan said. Behind them, across the clearing, Sheriff Dale Morrow was being helped out of one of the tactical vehicles in handcuffs, his face a landscape of collapsing composure. He did not look at Ethan. Ethan watched him go. Then he looked down at River, who was leaning lightly against his leg. He reached down and pressed his hand against the dog's warm side, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Good boy," he said quietly. "Good boy." The story broke on a Thursday morning. Dana Reyes's piece ran across national platforms simultaneously, a deliberate distribution strategy designed to make suppression impossible. By noon, it had been picked up by wire services. By evening, it was the lead story on every major network. The headline read, "Buried and Erased: How the U.S. Government Experimented on 31 Soldiers and Hid Them from History." Within 48 hours, 3 senior Defense Department officials were placed on administrative leave. A congressional investigation was announced. The Attorney General's office issued a statement acknowledging the existence of the Fort Briggs program for the first time in its institutional history. The families of 31 men, spread across 19 states, many of them elderly now, many of them having spent decades carrying a grief that had never been allowed a proper name, received phone calls. Each call began the same way. "We found him. We know where he is. We're bringing him home." Sheriff Dale Morrow was arrested on a Friday. The men who had come to the cabin that last night were traced to a private security contractor with documented ties to a classified DoD budget line. Federal charges were filed, and Douglas Harlan, who had disappeared 16 years ago, whose truck had been found running on a mountain road, whose case had been closed as exposure, was found on the North Ridge, 30 yards west of the last stone marker. He had not run away. He had not given up. He had died trying to finish what he had started. Ethan stood on the North Ridge on a morning 3 weeks later, when the forensics work was done and the military honor detail had come and gone and the clearing was quiet again, marked now with proper temporary markers while the permanent ones were being prepared. He stood at Douglas Harlan's marker. The stone was new, placed by Ethan 2 days after the identification was confirmed. On it, cut with a proper engraving tool that Ethan had driven 40 miles to buy, Douglas Ray Harlan, Sergeant, United States Army. He did not stop. River sat beside him. Neither of them moved for a long time. A government liaison had called Ethan that morning about compensation, recognition, a possible commendation from the Secretary of Defense. Ethan had listened politely. He was thinking about the cabin. The roof needed work. 2 sections of the ridge beam had softened and would need replacing before winter. The porch had to be rebuilt completely from scratch, the support posts reset in concrete this time. The well needed testing and probably a new pump. The track-in needed grading. Enough work for a year, maybe more. He looked out across the ridge, across the markers, across the sea of pines that stretched to the horizon in every direction, across the vast, deep silence of a place that had held a secret for 20 years and could now, finally, let it go. He had come here with $300 and the particular hollowness of a man who has finished one life and cannot yet see the shape of the next. He was still here. River nudged his hand with his nose, one warm, insistent push. Ethan looked down at him. The dog looked back, those deep brown eyes carrying, as they always had, more than a dog was supposed to be able to carry. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I know." He put his cap back on. "Come on, we've got work to do." They walked back down the mountain together, man and dog, moving through the pale morning light, through the pines and the cold, clean air, toward the cabin, toward the work, toward whatever came next, toward home. 31 men went into that ground without their names. They came out with them. Sometimes that is what it means to win. If this story stayed with you, if you believe the forgotten deserve to be found, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Your next story is already waiting.